Good afternoon, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce Kevin McCann, professor at Guelph University. And he is probably somebody that several of us who now study food web ecology had read through our life, like learning a lot about theory and food webs. And his main contributions have been about the effect of weak interactions on the stability of food webs. And also he has a great, fantastic book that I use for my ecological network classes, and some of it also for population and community ecology. He's also a great host. He had me visiting in Canada 2 years ago, maybe 1 year ago, 2 years ago, and like their students were great, and we had a party. They made Chilean empanadas, so they made me feel really good. So I'm hoping to be half as great as a host for him. So with that,
thanks a lot. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a great. Honestly, I know of you, Mish, very well, and it's an honor to be here, so thanks for asking me. So today, I'm going to talk, basically, in Guelph, I'm in an ag college, and we've got this group that just got an enormous amount of money, $83 million, to study sort of ag in a growing world. And as an ecologist, we're not used to money like that, and in this case, we're still not used to it. So the lion's share went to the ag people, but a small portion of 83, still a reasonable portion for ecologists, and it went to sort of saying, hey, what is it about sort of altering agriculture that could actually, big S sustainability in the sense that it's sustainable on the farm and off the farm. And as someone who, even though I'm a theoretician, I sort of work more in sort of aquatic systems. So basically what happens is we're doing work as a group, following the agriculture off the farm into the stream and looking at its impacts. And so along the way, some of the money we used as a working group. And in this working group with a whole bunch of ecologists from McGill, Guelph, and actually Brian LaPointe from Florida, is sort of broadening out and looking at nutrients on the landscape and what they might mean. And so today what I'm going to do is sort of give you the punchline ahead of the time. I'm going to sort of look at nutrients and stability and what they mean as a theoretician from a theoretical perspective. All right? And what I'm going to argue is steal from quantum entanglement, spooky action at a distance, which basically, as an ecologist, I'll give you my simple understanding of it, is these sort of two particles, sort of sister particles that can be separated at great distances, and yet you could put a spin on one and the other one will still actually react to that spin, even at great distances. And Einstein called that spooky action at a distance. The ecosystem version, and this will be the punchline for the paper, is that things like nutrients moving on the landscape, which are often locally applied, have been sort of the movement of those nutrients on the landscape have been sped up such that lots of times there is spooky action at a distance in terms of ecology too. And that is great ecosystem imbalances way away from the source of that local addition. So to me, what I'm going to sort of talk about is ecosystem entanglement via nutrients. They're transported across their landscape and what they mean for stability in sort of ecosystems. So here's the generic thing. We see global population projections, and even modest ones argue about by 2050 you'll have about 9.5 billion people on the planet. At the same time, we have massive rises in nutrients, things like nitrogen and phosphorus being applied to agricultural crops. All right, essentially, at the same time, not only do we have sort of all these nutrients being applied to the landscape, but we do things to the land use that interact with those nutrients. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is channelization, very strong conventional agriculture on both sides, and what used to be probably a stream or river that has actually been made into a channelized form that speeds up the propagation of water on the landscape. Similarly, we have things like tile drainage. Tile drainage is, at least in all the farms around our area, is put in almost exclusively on all farms. And that is these sort of tile drains that go underneath that drain the land. And in doing so, they actually are those like pipes in the upper right corner. They actually move water and nutrients across the landscape super quick. Okay, so what we've done here is we have these systems, we're throwing tons of nutrients on it, we have all kinds of additions that actually make those nutrients in water move rapidly across the landscape, okay? And in this case, those tile drainage will also get rid of things like wetlands, right? You put tile drainage in, and it often will actually then take wetlands and sort of move that water out. So one of the other things we're doing is removing wetlands, which are sort of frequently, from the perspective of this talk, I'm only thinking about them as sort of things that could slow down water movement and retain nutrients, okay? So two things are going on here. We have sort of global increase in nutrients being applied. We have populations growing who have bigger, more and more demand, and we expect even more demand coming in by 2050, a lot more, okay? And at the same time, the nutrients in water are moving across the landscape super quick. So from here on in, I'm going to sort of think of this as sort of that nutrients moving across ecosystems is sort of the potential for what I'm going to call ecosystem entanglement, where ecosystems off the farm into the stream, into larger streams, into larger rivers, and ultimately into oceans or Great Lakes or what have you. And there we have movements of those nutrients through other means, physical means, like currents, right? So there's all kinds of vectors that take these things and move them in space and effectively entangle ecosystems, all right? Okay, so with that, I kind of, with this working group, one of the things we're interested in is sort of say, okay, what's the theory on nutrient stability? And there is theory on nutrient stability in ecology, but there's surprisingly not a ton. And one of the reasons I think there is because there isn't a tremendous amount of ecosystem theory. There's lots of ecosystem models created for things like oceanography that follow sort of NPZD models and sort of trying to hook those up to sort of different types of hydrology things. But in terms of pure ecological theory, there isn't a ton of ecosystem stuff. Now, one of my co-supervisors, PhDs, was a great, in my opinion, a great ecologist, Don DeAngelis. And Don wrote a book, I think 1992, that does precisely what I just said people don't do. He wrote a whole book on nutrients and stability, and it's an excellent book. But in a sense, because I would argue, because despite Don having a ton of impact in ecology, that book on ecosystems really hasn't been picked up by the food web and ecology literature in general very well, I would argue. Okay? So the first thing I wanted to kind of go back to is sort of to relate nutrients to stability, is to think, well, what theory is out there? And one of the ones that many of you might know is this notion called the paradox of enrichment by Michael Rosenzweig. And by the way, this is one of the reasons we got interested in this, was because it's almost 50 years ago he wrote this. So it's like a 50-year sort of, you know, let's rethink this 50 years after this really excellent paper by Rosenzweig. But you can see here from this quote, Rosenzweig basically talks about primary productivity, and he basically argues such schemes of adding nutrients to the landscape may end up in catastrophe. Until we are confident that conclusions based on these systems do not apply to natural ecosystems, we must remain aware of the danger in setting enrichment as a human goal. So even in 71, there was already sort of this early sort of theory that argued nutrients ought to mean instability, was his argument. And his argument was that it was a paradox. And the reason there was a paradox is they're arguing, I'm adding nutrients, but somehow it drove instability. And instability here, I'll be more clear in a second, was such that it could drive collapse of ecosystems, okay? On the right-hand figure, I just wanted to show you what he meant by instability here, because later we're going to look at different forms of instability, okay? But in his case, he meant collapse of an ecosystem or a set of interactions, to be precise, consumer resource interactions, collapse by oscillation. So what basically he was arguing is that you add tons of nutrients and things, what I would call, it ramps energy from the resource to the consumer and it drives oscillations. Okay? And when things oscillate, predator and prey densities, for example, they attain low densities every once in a while, right? And since this is a deterministic model, a deterministic view of the world, you have to say, what would happen if there was stochasticity applied? And so when it gets to really low densities, you can imagine suddenly maybe there was a drought. And if there is, that system would collapse. So what he's basically arguing is oscillation collapse, that things are so wildly oscillating, when you add stochasticity, you'd expect potentially somewhere along the line that the system would no longer persist, okay? So that's the theory back 50 years ago. And so thinking about this in this working group, and being a theoretician and studying a lot to do with diversity stability, I kind of said, well, okay, let's revisit some of these ideas. By the way, just to let you know and warn you, I haven't given this talk before, and so I put this together on the weekend. I don't know how long this will be, but I can almost guarantee it'll be shorter than longer, just to make you feel comfortable, okay, since it's 4 o'clock. But having said that, I used to give 30 slides in my talks, and as an old guy, I'm now down to about 12. You find that in classes because you get more rambling with age, but I'm not going to ramble. Sorry, I'm rambling now. Anyway, so with theory, with this thing, nutrient stability, I kind of want to reflect on it a little bit because it was argued a paradox, and we're going to look back, and I'm going to sort of say, yeah, it's a paradox in one sense. You add production, but then you have collapse. But in another sense, it's very understandable as not a paradox at all. Okay? And so what I'm showing you here are isoclines, and I don't care if you fully understand them or not because I'm going to tell you the punchline. But on the upper figure is really Rosenzweig's result, theoretical result from way back when. And those isoclines are just, think of them as the geometry of some consumer resource interaction, so I can write down equations. Okay? And when I write down the equations, there's this thing called isoclines which tell you where the consumer doesn't grow in terms of density and the resource doesn't grow. Okay? What I love about isoclines is underneath of them is the mathematics, the geometry of the mathematics. And things like, if you go into heavier things like normal forms and stuff, they sort of are almost embodied in the isoclines, and I'm not going to go into those. But what happens is, when in his experiment, K is enrichment. That's a parameter in red. And he basically, as he increases it, he pulled those isoclines to the right. That's changing the geometry of the dynamics, okay? Turns out when the consumer isocline is to the left of the hump on that, it drives wild oscillations, okay? And so that was his result. He basically said, if I add productivity, parameter K here, enrichment, I ultimately get wild oscillations because the geometry changed in that way, okay? Since then, we've realized that in some sense, what's happening here can be actually happen due to other parameters, okay? So if it's a paradox for lots of other reasons too. And one of the things I'm showing you on the bottom is another way to get the same geometric shift, but through a different means, okay? Here I can do something like increase the attack rate of a consumer. Okay? And when I do it, instead of changing the K, the production of the resource, I change the efficiency of the consumer. And it's the same fundamental shift, in a sense, right? It basically moves you to the left of that hump and drives wild oscillations. Okay? So the whole point of this, as I'm trying to suggest to you, is that really underneath the paradox enrichment, there is this result that I would argue, all it's sort of saying is if you have ramp up energy through a food chain, through an interaction, whether it's driven by bottom-up increase in enrichment or simply having strong interaction strengths, you drive these wild oscillations, okay? And I'm going to say one more thing about that to sort of make an argument why I think it's sort of intuitive. So what I'm showing you there, weak interaction strength on the left or low enrichment, strong interaction strength or high enrichment on the right. And it's showing you that whether I do it through enrichment or through interaction strength, I get these wild oscillations. Now, the thing that makes it, to me, not so much of a paradox is if you look at my silly little diagrams. As a food web ecologist, we love diagrams with things connected together, almost to the point of it drives people crazy. So I'm showing you a weak interaction strength between a C and an R on the left, and then a larger one, a stronger one on the right. What happens in these things, if you follow the equilibria or even the mean response, is that when you ramp energy through an interaction, you inflate the top, you make the interaction strong, top heavy. Okay? And what really, when you think about it, if I add energy to an interaction and it shunts through the interaction, it'll start aggregating in the top thing. And if you just intuitively think about lots of biomass on a little bit about prey biomass, you can imagine it ought to topple. And in fact, indeed, that's what it does. So to me, this whole thing, the paradox enrichment, is an interesting answer, but it's also sort of something I think that ultimately is intuitive. And we're going to come back to that because I think part of the story of the paradox enrichment 50 years ago and since has been that in some sense it's been misunderstood. Okay? Okay. So we're talking about this nutrient stability theory. We have this paradox of enrichment, and it's been broadened to interaction strength. And now what I'm going to do is sort of say, listen, the theory for paradox enrichment, and indeed a lot of interaction strength stuff, was very, very simple. It was done with simple modules. So one of the things ecologists did, and I've done here with a postdoc of mine, Gabriel Gellner, who's an excellent ecologist, we basically sort of said, okay, if this is true, it sort of behooves us to ask whether sort of energy flux is destabilizing for very complex sets of interactions. Okay? And so what we've done here is the sort of Robert May style experiment, and I'll just walk through this very quickly. May basically, instead of doing very complex ordinary differential equation models of high dimension, you basically just examine the stability at the equilibrium. And by virtue of doing that, you take all those equations, instead of put them out as equations, you basically put the linearized form in a Jacobian. okay? And then what you do is you actually just use very simple stuff to calculate the maximum eigenvalue, okay? When you do that, the nice thing you can do is then do experiments where you draw from distributions on the left, and I'm not going to go through them, uniform, any form of distribution you want, and then you actually can do the same experiment we just did, but following now what's called a maximum eigenvalue. And the more, if it's positive, it means it's unstable, and the less negative means it's less stable too. So we can actually conduct high diversity experiments with this. So what I'm showing you on the bottom is that you basically get the same result of the paradox enrichment or strong interaction strengths. Is when you take a very complex web and you actually increase interaction strength here. You can think of that in these models as both being the diagonals and the off diagonals, and the diagonals really have the K involved in them. So this is the same result in my opinion. You can see that basically the eigenvalue gets more positive. That means it becomes unstable. And by the way, once it gets positive, it's unstable in two different kind of ways, either as sort of wild oscillations or exclusion of a loss of an equilibrium. So all I want you to realize here is that the theory suggests that this result ought to be able to be extended to large networks, okay? I'm not arguing that nature doesn't have things that's stabilizing. I'm just saying when you do this sort of thought experiment, that high energy flux through either a simple interaction or a very complex network yields the same result, okay? Instability. All right. So the question becomes, well, is there evidence for things like the paradox and enrichment? And it turns out there's really, really good evidence from microcosms. So microcosms are these experiments that ecologists love, and they're sort of like the equivalent of a vacuum experiment for physicists. You basically take, say, something like a rotifer, which is a tiny aquatic crustacean, and you put it in with algae, and you put it in a tiny test tube, okay? And you allow these things to unfold. And when they unfold, they're sort of growing. They're growing in this very tight space. And you can imagine that might even increase their interactions. And when you do that, you get stuff like this. And of course, this is an experiment on the left by a guy named Gregor Fussman from McGill. And basically what he's doing is A is low enrichment, B little higher, C little higher, and D high. And so when he walks through this experiment of increasing enrichment, he basically walks through all the predictions of those very simple CR models. It goes from not being able to persist because there's simply not enough energy, to the finally at D you get the wild oscillations. And by the way, you can see in D there, it's hard for you to tell, but the higher biomass is the consumer, the rotifer biomass. He's literally got top-heavy webs here. So it's very, very consistent with the most basic theory, all right? And so it really supports the thing, but it is an isolated experiment, so you sort of say, well, what about reality? And when you turn to reality, this is where there is a little bit of controversy. And what I'm showing you there on the right is a summary from a paper written by these people who do a lot of work on what's called ratio dependence. I'm not going into it, but I'm happy to comment on it. And basically, they argue both paradox enrichment is a counterintuitive theoretical prediction, which I just suggested to you. I do not think it's counterintuitive at all. I think it's very intuitive. That it's not supported by empirical evidence. And so I agree that it's not supported by empirical evidence, but it becomes interesting if you're trying to establish a nutrient stability theory to sort of say, well, what evidence is there out there for nutrients and stability? And by the way, everything I'm going to tell you empirically, I think people that study nutrients are going to say, well, I already knew that. In some sense, what I'm doing here is trying to tie the theory to make it match to things that are happening in nature, all right? And so what I'm showing you here is two things. But both of these are sort of now moving into the field and sort of saying, do we see nutrient stability, instability responses in the field? Okay, and on the left, I'm just showing you what a lot of people already would be familiar with, things like here in Lake Erie, dead zones, okay? And so clearly that's an example where there's tons of nutrients emptying into an ecosystem and there's a loss of that ecosystem. Okay, clearly there's a lot of spatial components to this, and I'm going to come back to that later. The other thing I want to point out about that, if you think about this loss of equilibrium, it's probably not a wild oscillation, right? It's actually probably a loss of equilibrium in and of itself. And what I mean by that is, this is a case where nutrients are added to a body of water and something like inedible algae starts to take off. And when it does, it starts to outcompete things like edible algae. And in a sense, what it's going to do is you're going to get a whole system that's categorized by inedible algae and the loss of a lot of other things, which would be the loss of an equilibrium, not necessarily wild oscillations. So I'm saying that because that basically says the old theory, paradox enrichment, is sort of potentially only focusing on one form of collapse, oscillatory collapse, and you may need to think about both, okay? On the right, I'm showing you empirical examples of oscillations in nature, just to sort of argue there's tons of examples of oscillatory cycles in nature. I'm showing you one with wolves and moose on Isle Royale. I'm not going to go through that, but interesting, that's sort of like a microcosm. That's happening on a small ecosystem, right? On an island. And there's arguments that you'd expect high attack rates when you take something like a wolf, put it on a small island with moose. That's like me throwing, you know, I don't know, this room is covered in gas and I threw a bunch of goats in here. And grass. I meant. My apology. But if you put a bunch of goats in here with grass, they would outconsume it in days and then starve, right? So tight spaces probably make strong interactions. So I think that's saying less about the paradox enrichment and more about the energy flux interaction strength result. Anyway, I'm not going to go through these other ones, but there's in the north, there's 50% of the examples from time series sort of harnessed through data show examples of oscillatory nature. So clearly there is sort of oscillations out there in nature. And one thing I will say is that when you look at sort of, are they a relationship with production or nutrient enrichment, it doesn't appear so. All of those ones seem to happen in cases that we've sort of unpacked that aren't really around nutrient enrichment. So it may suggest that where the paradox of enrichment might be sort of wrong is it doesn't manifest as oscillatory outcomes, okay? All right, so to this point, I just want to sort of argue that we've basically argued the nutrients are increasing on the landscape. It's all kinds of things that are speeding up their movement. It's very much, I'm calling that ecosystem entanglement. But it's happening in a spatial framework, and the theory so far out there, things like the paradox enrichment, and even the nutrient work of Don DeAngelis is sort of in a non-spatial context, okay? The second thing I wanted to argue is that there's a ton of there's experimental evidence for paradox of enrichment, but there's mixed arguments, empirical evidence for sort of nutrient instability and how it comes out. But the important thing I want you to realize is that it at least suggests there might be two forms of loss of instability, one to oscillations and one to equilibrium loss. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is switch to the second phase, and I'm going to sort of take what we've just learned and sort of motivate a simple model, okay? And really what the model is, before I move any further, is I'm going to decidedly put space into it. Because everything, in a sense, what I'm arguing here is there's lots of things that are moving things like nutrients in space, all right? And so we're going to think about things like connectivity on the landscape. The second thing I want you to want to draw from is very recently, I've been arguing there's been a ton of ecosystem theory, but very recently there's been this stuff called meta-ecosystems. Ecology loves meta. There's meta-pops, meta-communities, and now there's meta-ecosystems. And meta-ecosystems just acknowledges the fact that ecosystems are connected through a bunch of different means, right? And so they're transferring nutrients, they're moving organisms across them, and it's sort of, if you're thinking about this at a food web scale, which by the way often ignores ecosystem boundaries, then you kind of need to think about this at least a little bit. Okay, so in some sense, what I'm going to do is steal from meta-ecosystem theory almost entirely, but most of the stuff that they've done is being like sort of two ecosystems coupled together. As you can imagine, when you're taking on a new theoretical problem, you start with sort of the simplest version, right? Okay, so what I want to do is we're going to use a meta-ecosystem approach, but now I want to think about how we're going to do it spatially, and I'm just going to outline that we're going to do two things. I'm kind of thinking of a bottom-up approach where I'm going to follow nutrients moving on the landscape, okay? And I want you to think about it. We're going to think about nutrients moving in phases. So here I'm showing you sort of a classical nutrient watershed, and nutrients move from the upper hills down through the valley and out into a sort of Great Lake or ocean. I also want to point out that once you're out in that Great Lake and ocean, there's another form of connectivity potentially, and that's physical movements like currents. Okay, we're going to come back to that. So I wanted to think, I'm going to end up using a model where I'm going to see different phases of movement. Say movements off the landscape into the coast, and then a second phase from the coast out and away. Okay. The other thing I want to point out is there's all kinds of migrations that can actually do things to sort of move nutrients on the landscape as well. And so here I'm showing you snow geese. Okay, but there's all kinds of things. So we're going to look at both bottom-up movements via nutrients and top-down via consumers. Okay. So with that said, basically what I'm going to start with is a very simple model. And really what I'm showing you today is just starting to think about this stuff, and we're going to do a lot more, and really I think what I'm showing you is actually quite easy. So basically what I'm kind of doing is cheating and making a sort of a simple dendritic unidirectional movement here, okay? And so that space, 1, 2, and 3, let's imagine that as like 3 farms on a landscape. Okay, and those 3 local farms then have connection via water or streams to a hub. Let's say it's a river, okay? And that river then is a hub down to a terminal node, let's say a lake or a coastal ocean, Okay, so basically I'm setting up a simple dendritic network that is about only five spatial nodes. Okay, in those I'm going to put two different types of models, both ecosystem models. One, a consumer resource model that has nutrients and detritus, right? And I'm going to do that because we're going to replicate the paradox of enrichment. And then I'm going to do one that has less edible and edible resources. And I'm going to do that because inedible algae or less edible algae becomes a role in many of the sort of nutrient instability cases we see empirically. And so it's sort of a first step to kind of get at that. And it's also sort of me anticipating different types of instability. Okay, so then the experiment's going to be this. Already I've got 5 nodes and 4 and 5 dimensional ODEs. So we got lots of model, like 20 dimensions to 25 dimensions. So a ton to work with. So all I'm going to do is make this very simple. I'm going to imagine my nodes are of 2 kinds. Okay, low impact nodes where we have low nutrient loading and low connectedness in terms of speed. Okay, and then high impact, I can imagine this like a conventional farm with high nutrient loading and then high speed with all those sort of channelized water movements. All right. I'm going to consider 2 cases, and I'll tell you when I'm considering which: nutrient movement alone and then consumer movement alone. Clearly, the real issue is both move, okay? And then finally, I'm going to do a theoretical experiment where when you see all blue, that means everything is highly high impact, okay? Conventional farms as an example. What I'm going to do is take something like this homogeneous network, and I'm going to turn up the nutrient amounts. Okay, and I'm going to turn up the speed at the same time. So the experiment really is that I'm going to turn up the speed of nutrient movement through the system, and we're going to ask 2 things. We're going to ask what happens in terms of stability, and where does it happen in that space. Okay, so what you can see here, I've got the 2 phases: movement phase 1, movement phase 2. Here we've got the classical ecosystem in each one of those nodes. And what I'm showing you here is a representation of the dynamics as I do that experiment for nodes 1 to 3. It doesn't matter which one because they're all the same, right? It's a homogenized network I'm talking about in this case. Hub node is that one, is in the middle, and finally the terminal node. Thing I want you to realize this is when I do this diffusion experiment, when I'm turning up the rate of speed here, what happens is we get nutrients going everywhere, but they aggregate in the terminal node. Not surprising, really. But then when you look here, that's a bifurcation diagram, and let me interpret for you if you don't know it. It basically means that there's wild oscillations above about 0.1 in the final node. Okay, so this is the first thing where I'm increasing ecosystem entanglement, the speed, and we're getting the instability in the final node. So this is sort of that ecosystem entanglement. We're getting spooky action at a distance, and all the nutrients, in this case, they're at 1, 2, 3 in the hub, but you could even do this just to the local 1, 2, and 3. So the first result there is we have loss of stability of that sort of paradox enrichment, but in space it's happening distant from the local additions. Now what we're going to do is sort of say, okay, well, let's take a slightly more realistic web with inedible algae. And again, that model up in the right-hand corner is all those spatial nodes, and now we're doing the same experiment again. Now this time, we see nodes 1 and 3, not much is happening. Hub node changes a bit. But what we have in this terminal node is basically the loss of an equilibrium. You lose the edible algae and you lose some other things. I'm not going to walk through it. But basically, this is a different form of instability loss and didn't manifest in the paradox enrichment, right? But it's still something that ought to happen rather commonly in nutrient enrichment. And again, this is probably a little more consistent with what we see in the real world. Okay, so then both of those were nutrient movement. Now I'm just going to turn to a second case, the consumer movement, because we're going to come back empirically to look at this as well. So in this case, I've got, again, the classical CR ecosystem model. We have the spatial node, but now I'm turning, instead of nutrients moving, they're not moving, I'm only moving the consumers. Okay, we're thinking about migration now. And again, we have the different results in nodes 1 to 3, hub node and terminal, but I want to point out to you what happens here in the terminal node, you get the aggregation of consumers, and they suppress the resource to extinction. Okay, and so what's happening here is you get consumer inflation in space from local nutrients, as opposed to, they get inflated locally and then they move and then they suppress where they aggregate in the final terminal node. And I'm going to show you an empirical example that matches this. But again, it's that sort of spooky action at a distance. You have a lot of nutrients locally, and you have some vector that ties the system very rapidly over potentially great distances. Okay, and so interestingly, and something that I was sort of curious about, From a food web network perspective, we know that sort of if you have lots of strong interactions, and they showed instability, and I talked about that earlier, you can actually sort of, if you dial back the right interactions, you can actually have muting and stabilization. So that happens in an ecological network. A parallel question or thing you could ask is, does that happen in spatial networks? And in some sense, that's what I'm showing you here. What I'm doing now is we used to have a homogenized high-impact web, impact nodes everywhere. Now we're putting a slow, low-impact node in the middle. So think what it's doing. Nutrients are moving through the landscape, then they aggregate there because it's slow. It's not being pushed through, and it's also very low in terms of nutrient additions. And so what happens here, now when we look at this, the hub node in this case becomes destabilized, right? It's basically bleeded off the nutrients and not allowed it to make to that terminal node where we were seeing the instabilities before. So now the trick to this is basically what it's saying is, if you actually put slow nodes in the right spot, in other words, in a more specific sense, if you put sort of zones that actually weren't high impact conventional farms, you actually might be able to kind of mitigate where the expression of that nutrients. Okay? In a sense, they're bleeding off the nutrients. Slowing it down allows the biota to sort of uptake the nutrients and sort of burn them off. Okay, so basically what we've shown here in the theory is high local nutrient additions in space, either you can top down or bottom up, but that entanglement drives instability at great distances often. Okay, and that instability can be through oscillatory variety, or it could be through the entire loss of an equilibrium, which is clearly a loss of stability. And then you could add heterogeneity to this landscape, such that if you add slow ones and weaken that sort of entanglement, you actually can stop, you can prevent that. And in the case I showed you, actually you just pushed it into the hub node. But you can also imagine more complex dendritic networks that you could put just enough of them to bleed it off in ways that you never really had an expression of instability. Okay, so the third phase of this talk, and not a ton left, I am going to be a little short, is basically just to walk through some of the empirical examples that I would argue sort of show this spooky action at a distance, okay? And here, this is an obvious one, and it's obvious in the sense that it motivated what we were doing. And so what I'm showing you over on the right is that basically, I'm now talking about a situation where we have farms 1, 2, and 3. We have the movements of nutrients to rivers and finally out to sort of oceans or lakes. And in those ocean and lakes, we actually have dead zones. And that's what I'm showing you here from 1910 to 2010, paper by Diaz and Rosenberg in 2008, showing sort of the increased number of dead zones globally. Okay, so this is sort of showing us that spooky action at a distance, or these sort of dead zones, are increasing dramatically on the landscape, and that may not be surprising, given the amount of nutrients and also the things we're doing to the landscape. Second thing I wanted to point out is a sort of an interesting example of this sort of spooky action at a distance is by one of the guys in my group. Brian LaPointe was part of this paper, and this came out just fairly recently in Science. There's a bunch of different examples of this called golden tides and green tides, but the Great Atlantic Sargassum Belt is basically a golden tide example. And so here's an example where we see actually in South America, the argument is through satellite data, and the argument over exactly what's happening is still unfolding. But in a recent Science paper, they sort of argued that, listen, in the Amazon, there was a whole bunch of deforestation at a certain point and nutrient additions. Those nutrients bleeded off the landscape, landed into the water, and in the water, pelagic sargassum, a macroalgae, flourished. Okay, it was always there, but it flourished now. It then got caught in the second wave of this sort of spooky action at a distance. It moved all the way off the landscape, aggregates as that pelagic sargassum, now gets pushed by currents, both to Africa and to the Caribbean. And for about, I don't know, a whole bunch of years now, people were trying to relax on the beaches in the Caribbean have been teamed with this macroalgae everywhere. And so the argument here is that basically that it's like an 8,500 square kilometer plume of this stuff. And so that it just absolutely was ignited by that landscape and then pushed everywhere. So in a sense, it's a really classical example of this spooky action at a distance. Something happened in South America impacting tourists in the Caribbean, okay, in a very, very dramatic way. Number of examples of that. Another example I kind of wanted to talk about was with this guy I'm working with, Brian LaPointe, and this is Lou Key in Florida. Now, Brian is one of the guys working with us, and he's done a 3-decade study as a coral reef biologist down there. And what's interesting about this case is that basically in about the early 90s, the Army Corps of Engineers, through a variety of reasons, were actually promoted by the government to actually speed up the movement of water on the land from Lake Okeechobee to down to the Keys. okay? And they did that for a variety of reasons, and I don't think they were ridiculous. One of the things is a lot of the seagrass was becoming hypersaline in that thing. And so the argument was adding more water would actually change that hypersalinity. But when you're doing that, you're sort of unwittingly doing the experiment we were just talking about. You're speeding up the movement of nutrients on the landscape. Okay, and when they did that, what Brian is showing here is the flow rate, but also sort of the dissolved inorganic nitrogen, and you can see there was a spike of it after the 90s. And this is a newspaper article from since then. There's been a whole bunch of sort of dead zone sort of materializing that region, and also a lot of coral deterioration. Now, the coral deterioration probably has something to do with the nutrients, but also sort of warming at the same time. But it sort of again argues how much a local interaction. In this case, Brian argues the lion's share of this nutrients is actually from toilets flushing in the Orlando area, right? There's a role for agriculture, but there's also more of a role in his argument from toilets flushing from Orlando with all the development. So again, hundreds of kilometers moving across the landscape and impacting multiple ecosystems and ultimately driving instability of a coral reef and a collapse. Here's why I was interested in things like the consumer movement. This is another example that's sort of this case, but now I've been talking about movement of nutrients through space. Now we're going to talk about consumers. What I'm showing you here again is the model on the left, and instead now we have things like snow geese foraging in 1, 2, and 3, and then migrating enormous distances to sort of from southern states all the way up to Hudson Bay, okay? And so what they're doing in this case is there's a guy named Bob Jeffries who followed this until he passed about 2 or 3 years ago, really good biologist from U of T and a gentleman. And what he did is no one understood quite what was happening, but snow geese suddenly started taking off in the 50s. And snow geese grew to super high densities. And as he followed it, he started to realize and made arguments for it, mostly empirical, not sort of experimental, but argued that sort of in the 50s, we started using the Haber-Bosch process to add nitrogen to all these things. And so the rise of fertilizer application in places like Texas and that sort of correlates really well with the snow geese rise. Okay, so they're foraging locally on cereal crops and blowing up to huge densities and then migrating thousands of kilometers up to their sort of overwintering, summer zones in Hudson Bay. And there, instead of feeding in the crop area, they go to the marshlands and sort of feed and decimate those areas. They completely suppressed out things like the sedges, et cetera. And again, that's a complete loss of an equilibrium. It's again that form of instability. All right. And what you're showing down there is he had this experiment where he excluded the snow geese, and you can see that's what it usually looks like. And outside, you see nothing but sort of the soil trampled and them having grubbed out all the sedges. So again, an example of a local application in Texas and a massive instability way out in a whole different ecosystem across the continent. All right. Final thing I just want to kind of argue about, I've only talked about space here, and I've talked about nutrient applications, but the argument here is that you have nutrient inflation in a terminal node, right? But you can also now think about this theoretically in terms of temporal inflation as well. Okay, so imagine, for example, now that we have climate change that then drives nutrient to run off much more rapidly, say in the spring, as opposed to all year round. So imagine farmers, for example, often will put nutrients on in the late fall. And why do they do that? Because they want the crops to start growing early in spring, right? So you got a whole bunch of nutrients on there. Now you have a massive rainfall, let's say during a thaw event in the winter. Then that rainfall will grab those nutrients, and it's in the winter, it'll start pressing them through the landscape. And by the way, in the winter, there's not a lot of biota to uptake that nutrients, right? So it'll flush it all the way down, almost unsort of mitigated. Right? And so why I've talked about spatial amplification, clearly there's a real role for temporal amplification if you have greater sort of precipitation events during certain times of year as well. So the ideas I talked about, spatial amplification, should scale up to temporal amplification and suggest that things like climate change should intersect again with issues like nutrient runoff and instabilities. So there, I'm going to leave you. I am a little early, only about 40 minutes. I'm just going to end by giving you a summary. I'm arguing that, in some sense, having fun with the notion of quantum entanglement and spooky action and distance, sort of arguing that with nutrients, we should have this in spades. We have all kinds of local nutrient applications and tons of vectors, physical and even migratory, that move the impact of those local nutrients around the globe. And they drive instabilities, not just of the oscillatory kind, but often they should drive of the kind where we have a complete loss of an equilibrium. Suppression, say, by the snow geese of all the grasses. Inedible dominance and the proliferation of detritus, which has bacteria sort of grow to great densities and consume all the oxygen, things like that. All right? Final thing I want to say is we're kind of playing this out more complicated sort of landscapes now, and we're really interested in the question of sort of saying, what does the dendritic structure mean for this in terms of the amplification? And two, how can you actually play games on the landscape where you actually make the right set of slow nodes in the right place to actually mitigate sort of so that there isn't any massive sort of instability anywhere on the landscape, but rather mute it across the landscape in some sort of reasonable way, okay? And with that, I'll end right there and take questions.
Plenty of time for questions.
It's 4:40. I realize it gets tricky. Yes?
Thank you very much for the talk. I thought that the dendritic network idea was an interesting way of thinking about Flux. And I'm curious if it's, because you've done a lot of work in the Great Lakes with migration, but have you done it specifically with something like invasive species, particularly Asian carp?
Yeah.
Or has anyone looked at the same kind of systematic way of thinking about it, where right now they're kind of like dammed in, we're trying to keep them from certain Great Lakes, but could something be done to keep them out of the hub further upstream, or is it only something at this point right now? Is it just kind of make sure that dam holds?
Yeah, I don't know. I can't answer that question. So you're thinking sort of more like, okay, so you're thinking about consumer movement here, and in this case, something like an invasive species. And the question is, will it have a massive impact when it makes it into the Great Lakes, and how you prevent that? And can you use ideas like this to think about it? Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't thought about that, but I will. No, that's neat. I don't have a clear thought on it right in this moment, but I will dwell on it and catch you later. All right? Yes?
Well, the problem of nutrients in agriculture is a long-standing one, especially in the last 60 years when nutrients have been moving from the landscape into the oceans, and then, sort of then they kind of stop there for a bit. So I'm wondering if you're partly because we're not recycling them on the landscape. So
Yeah.
as you're pointing out here, I'm wondering if your theoretical approach points to any kind of system in which we could be either recycling them at the end point, bringing them back into the system.
Yeah.
You're proposing something here where you simply slow down the movement.
And that's one and only one thing. I'm playing that game because I'm thinking about it spatially. Clearly, there's lots of ways to think about this. Yeah.
It's a big problem with
Yeah.
so much. Even human sewage, which is a huge
Yeah.
source of nutrients, which is being
Yeah.
piped out to waterways. And I wonder, are you folks? Is your theoretical approach enabling you to see any new approaches to that dilemma?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question. And I don't know the answer to whether we've got wonderful new approaches yet, but I would argue even thinking about this in the way we are probably would aid already very specific, detailed approaches at it, because I've been talking to people who are doing this and not thinking along these ways exactly. So I think it does already aid that. But I like your recycling idea, because there's clearly things we can do with stuff like that. And I was talking to the Algae Lab earlier, and for example, things like that macroalgae blooms. There's things you ought to be able to, there's 8,500 square kilometers of macroalgae. There's got to be things we could do with that to sort of play a recycling game. And instead of, while we're trying to fight this from happening, but also use that stuff to actually take advantage of it in a way that could actually maybe be a win-win. I think that's sort of what you're saying, isn't it? Yeah, I agree. And those are interesting ways to look at it, for sure. Yes, sir.
I remember when Judy Meyer was doing work on land use change and stream communities. One of the things she found in the southern Appalachians was an enormous time lag in how long a landscape. Time lag is the wrong word. The imprint of what happened on that landscape took a long time to disappear in the stream.
Yeah, that's cool.
I remember her showing, some kind of ordination where this stream should have been in one place, but it was clearly another. And it was actually a land use history that was 40 years previously.
Yeah.
It was still impacting what you saw today.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that's an example where chronic slowdown of the loss of nutrients. In other words, they're percolating probably slowly off that landscape.
Yeah.
So the effect lasts a very long time.
Yeah,
Pulling that space-time kind of...
yeah, that's super cool. That's really interesting because I agree with you. There's all kinds of legacy effects of these nutrient buildups because of sedimentation processes. So even if you put on the brakes, there's a wicked transient afterwards because of these sediment buildups. And you see that in the Lake Erie watershed, and you see that everywhere. So your question, your follow-up question on that is that putting slow down things might actually might drive that even more.
I was wondering if that would actually increase the stability in some way if all of those nutrients which were causing the legacy effect all came out at one
Oh
time.
yeah, 100%.
So it might be less stable.
It would increase the it would decrease the transient towards something better if you could do that. Absolutely. But no, I've ignored the legacy effects here, and there's tons of them. That means nutrients that are in the sediment of the streams, rivers, oceans, and they get kicked up, bioperturbed by even by invasive species, for example. Things like mussels can do that in the Great Lakes. Yeah, that's a very good point.
And I did want to, if no one else minds, ask about the racial dependence. You said that you would give an opinion if asked.
Yeah,
And
so...
I haven't thought about it since the original arguments between Alan Berryman and Lev Ginsberg.
Yeah.
I haven't paid any attention. So isn't the idea there then that if you've got a nutrient input, you're going to see increases rather than just all of that stuff going up to the top level? It's going to sort of increase at all levels?
So they have a model that basically says, and I'm going to tell you what, I'm going to reinterpret their result as opposed to say they're wrong or right. And this model suggests that nutrients come in, flux up to the sea, sea gets top heavy and unstable. Their model actually has this thing called ratio dependence, which basically says as I feed at a rate relative to my own density. So what they're invoking in that model is inhibition of energy flow through interference. Okay? So that's the mechanism. And no one ever talks about that exactly. Now I turn up things like enrichment. What happens in their model, according to their parameterization, which, by the way, only happens due to a pathology, and that is and I won't go into that, but basically what happens is as you turn up the nutrients, what their model says, interference outweighs the destabilization role of production. So that's really the interpretation. So then if I were to go to the real world, I would say, when does interference outweigh production? And if it is, they're right all the time. And if it doesn't, then they might be right sometimes. So, yeah. So, but it's always been interpreted, paradox enrichment is wrong. I'm sort of saying, don't think of it that way. Think of it, it's wrong if interference outweighs production. Yeah. Thanks for the question, though.
Production of the predators.
Well, I mean production, like that. There's a nutrient enrichment result that's destabilizing fundamentally according to the simplest vacuum experiments. If I then make interference, which will stop energy flux, if I make it outweigh production, then it outweighs the destabilization result. So that's what their result does. It's sort of saying one mechanism outweighs the other, and they always talk about it as this versus that. I would rather think of it that way, because then it becomes an empirical question. Well, thanks. Oh, sorry. Yeah.
We think about the difference between the velocity of the nutrient movement and the mass. So for example, you can increase the water flow if you speed up the rate at which things are moving, but the nutrients are diluted by all that water. So you have quick movement.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm cheating here. In some sense, what we're showing you is this. And that's why we have more work to do. That's a wonderful question. So what we're doing here is assuming that all the streams are the same size on their way to the thing, but there is a dilution effect naturally. So we've done it both ways, and the one I'm showing is only the one way, and you still get the outcome in the distance because you get the aggregation of nutrients. It doesn't matter. But you're right, to think about this, really you need to think about both aspects, and we're starting to think more about the dilution effect, but there's sort of, it's not as simple as they just perfect dilution. 3 streams make 3 times the dilution because there's more stream morphology. So we're actually we're talking to people to think about this a little better. But that's a very good point. There's the dilution effect as well. Nonetheless, at the terminal node, you're still always going to get that sort of buildup of nutrients, right?
So I wonder if at the terminal node, it doesn't really matter how long it takes to get there, as long as if a certain mass gets there.
I agree with you. I agree with you. So well said. So if I change this experiment to just don't change the speed but change the amount, then you're going to get the same impact. They're equivalent at some level. Very good point. So that sort of would suggest then adding lots of nutrients and keeping the system slow, you're still going to ultimately be in trouble. Yeah, fair enough. Good question. Anything else? Thanks a lot. I appreciate that. Thanks for coming.